Chapter 4. Which Bitcoin is the real Bitcoin? Direct answer? It's complicated. I truthfully can't give you a direct answer. There are quite a few cryptocurrencies out there that share the Bitcoin moniker, whether it's Bitcoin Dark, Bitcoin Gold, Bitcoin God, or most notably, Bitcoin Cash. It can become easy to get lost in the myriad of Bitcoin-like coins. Which of these is the real Bitcoin? For the most part, you can cross most Bitcoin-like coins off of the list if they were made prior to August 1st, 2017. It's very unlikely that even the coins themselves would argue much with you. However, there is a very heated debate in the cryptosphere about the validity of two coins in particular, Bitcoin and Bitcoin Cash. I have done my best to be as straightforward with you as possible, and I'm going to let you know right now that this is easily going to be the most controversial chapter of this entire book. The community has been divided on this issue for quite some time, and it is probably the most emotionally laden topic in the entire space. I am going to try and provide some insight on the matter, but before anything, I need to explain a few things. Bitcoin is open source and decentralized. Several attempts have been made prior to Bitcoin to create an e-currency. None of them have worked. Satoshi believed that it was due to the centralized nature of these currencies. Governments are good at cutting the heads off of centrally controlled networks like Napster, but pure peer-to-peer networks like Nutella and Tor seem to be holding their own. Satoshi Nakamoto, Bitcoin peer-to-peer e-cash paper. It would make sense. He's creating a currency that would effectively undermine the dominance of national currencies. It's important for the currency to not be silenced. Otherwise, it would not be able to grow. In order to properly implement this protocol, he also made the Bitcoin code open source. Anyone could participate in the creation of Bitcoin. Anyone can run Bitcoin. By making Bitcoin open source, it is truly decentralized and thus is unstoppable. However, by making Bitcoin an open source project, you also make it vulnerable to forks. What is a fork? In any open source project, developers need to be able to add to the existing product. However, if every developer started writing on the master, then the project would be chaos and it wouldn't get very far. In order to rectify this, developers can fork the repository. The forked version then splits off from the original version, like a fork in the road. Typically speaking, the developer would then update the code of this version and push updates onto the original version. This process would then merge the two separate forks into one program. However, there are cases when the new version and the old version are incompatible, and as a consequence, the two projects split off from one another and go in two different directions. With Bitcoin, there have been many forks, most of which have been soft forks. A soft fork is usually some update to the protocol, and previously valid blocks are now made invalid. This change is backwards compatible, i.e., older nodes can implement this change without having to upgrade. This decision regarding soft forks are left up to the community, and when a majority of the nodes agree, the fork is implemented. Remember, if the majority of the nodes want to go in a different direction, they have control over the longest chain. Consider a chain of blocks from non-upgraded nodes moving left to right. These nodes follow the old rules of the system. That is, they are operating prior to any change. After the second block, a soft fork is implemented. All nodes prior to this one were previously valid, but now violate the new rules that have been added to the system. As a consequence, those nodes are no longer part of the longest chain. They are now obsolete or invalid. All subsequent nodes satisfy the old and new rules. No upgrade was necessary. They are simply the next link in the chain. The nodes now continue on as if nothing happened, connecting to the next valid node. In contrast, there exists what is known as a hard fork. I bet you didn't see that coming. Hard forks are quite different, and they usually are due to a fundamental disagreement about the direction a coin ought to take. Most notable hard fork is Bitcoin Cash. Trust me, I will talk about this soon. Essentially, the community decides to implement a new change that will fundamentally alter all blocks that exist going forward. If all members of the community agree, then great, no issues, and the old fork simply dies. However, since we are human, we can rarely agree on anything. If there is a lack of consensus, then at a specified block, the code base splits, one of which implements the new rules, and the other implements the old rules. This leaves you with two separate coins that have a shared history. Typically, the holders of the coin pre-hard fork are rewarded with both coins in what is called a one-to-one airdrop. A nice reward to the community for holding through the ruckus, but also as a means to create free promotion for the new coin. What works better for a promotion than free money? As in the previous example, the coin had a singular shared blockchain until we reach the point where the code base forks. Now, you have two separate coins with two distinct blockchains. It is important to note that this type of fork is not backwards compatible. The two chains are diverging and creating two separate entities that will only become more and more dissimilar over time. Bitcoin Cash and the SegWit debacle. Alright, now I've brought us to the most contentious issue in the cryptosphere. I will first provide a brief background on the issue. Then I will present both sides of the debacle. And finally, I will provide my opinion. I want to make this abundantly clear. I have not been paid by any party. I have no affiliation with any party. I am simply a member of the crypto community that doesn't feel any strong ties either way, which means I can objectively speak on the matter given my expertise in the space. Now that the disclaimer is over, let's get down to it. SegWit. To begin, Bitcoin was beginning to experience congestion. The developers, as well as many in the community, noticed that this would become a major problem as time went on. If the blocks are overly congested, it would take a long time for transactions to be confirmed on the blockchain, and the dream of Bitcoin competing with payment systems such as Visa would be over. Great, the community identified the problem. Now they just had to agree on the solution. Two solutions were proposed: Bitcoin Unlimited and SegWit. Bitcoin Unlimited's idea was simple: completely remove the block size limitation on Bitcoin. The purpose of the 1 megabyte limit on each block was simply to guard against DDoS attacks, or denial of service attacks. It's really not important to have a strong grasp on what that means. Just know it's annoying hackers filling the blocks with junk. The miners loved this idea. From their perspective, it was great. If you have no cap on how large blocks can be, then it will require that much more effort to mine each block, and consequently, each block rewards the miners more. Perfect. However, the community figured that this would centralize mining. If blocks get too large, then only the largest mining pools or groups of miners could mine blocks. The little guy would be completely SOL. Ultimately, the community shied away from this idea. The other proposal was SegWit, short for Segregated Witness. The developers figured they could kill two birds with one stone. In every Bitcoin transaction, there's a cryptographic signature that essentially validates the transaction. However, up until this point, the signature did not contain all of the data about the transaction. So, it was theoretically possible to alter the signature in such a way that you can sneak extra Bitcoin into the transaction. This is known as transaction malleability. The developers, using some serious programming voodoo, decided to Frankenstein the transaction process, segregating part of the transaction information and taking it off the blockchain. This would allow for them to put more transactions into each block, since a piece of the transaction data had been removed. And this new feature can be exploited to solve the malleability problem. Though this solution ended up being implemented, many people thought it was simply a temporary solution to the problem, and that Bitcoin Unlimited's approach was better. In order to satisfy everyone, a compromise was made. This protocol, named SegWit 2x, both stored some of the transaction data outside of the blockchain and increased the block size to 2 megabytes. Ultimately, 95% of miners agreed to the proposal, and the changes were implemented. Here's where the controversy begins. Bitcoin Cash. Some people were not too keen on this SegWit 2x proposal. Many prominent figures in the cryptosphere were very vocal about their opposition. You see, the issue they had was, well, at the risk of sounding like a meme, that SegWit 2x went against Satoshi's true vision. Limiting the block size will eventually create congestion in the Bitcoin network. Ultimately, the price for transactions will increase to such a point that micropayments will be infeasible. The idea that you can go to the store and buy a $3 coffee would be completely off the table. Thus, at the Future of Bitcoin conference, a developer by the name of Amari Tasheme proposed Bitcoin ABC, the first version of what would be later known as Bitcoin Cash. Tasheme and his team of developers decided to increase the block size limit to 8 megabytes, which is such a drastic change from the Bitcoin protocol that a hard fork was required. Additionally, the team made it clear they had no real aversion to increasing the block size further down the road. To them, the block size was simply a means to an end. If Bitcoin cannot be used as a means of exchange due to block congestion, you can indefinitely increase block size. Eventually, computing power will match. Due to its consistently low transaction fees and general business-focused philosophy, Bitcoin Cash was an immediate success. Within its first day of existence, it jumped to the third largest market cap. Quote, Bitcoin's usefulness as a store of value comes as a secondary effect from its usefulness as a medium of exchange. If you destroy the medium of exchange, you destroy the store of value. Roger K. Ver, CEO of Bitcoin.com. Bitcoin Cash gets a lot of hate. The Bitcoin community believes that it is simply profiting off of the Bitcoin moniker and that many of its marketing techniques are being used to deceive newcomers. For instance, Bitcoin.com is owned by Roger Ver, who is one of the largest Bitcoin Cash supporters. Since Bitcoin.com is ultimately about Bitcoin Cash, henceforth referred to as BCH, many believe it is clearly a fraudulent enterprise aiming to deceive. In response, Roger Ver, as well as Jihan Wu, have argued by saying that Bitcoin Cash is the real Bitcoin. Pause. We had the opportunity to speak about the essence of Bitcoin. We have talked about the Bitcoin white paper, and we have talked about forks. Let's take a moment to rationally analyze the situation before we continue. Bitcoin Cash is the byproduct of a hard fork. That's it. We can wrap it up here. BCH is clearly not the original. Look, it even has a different name. Well, not quite. Let's think about the origin of BCH. The community decided to implement a change. S2X, or SegWit 2X, was designed to change the Bitcoin protocol. It was a hard fork in itself. Let me repeat. S2X was a hard fork from the old Bitcoin protocol. We have seen the chart. That means there are now two separate blockchains, but prior to the hard fork, the two chains have the exact same history. Well, here's where the funny business starts. Technically speaking, BCH implemented its hard fork on August 1st, 2017. That means up until August 1st, 2017, BCH and BTC had the exact same chain. They were the same entity. Let's call the pre-hard fork chain, Chain A. Now, when BCH created its split, BCH became a spin-off of Chain A. This spin-off has one difference. Instead of having a cap of 1 megabyte on the blocks, BCH has a cap of 8 megabytes. As far as changes are concerned, it's significant, but in practice, the coin is effectively the same. The blocks are too large to be filled easily, so BCH operates pretty much identically to Chain A. In fact, if we double back to the section of SegWit, BCH is much like the Bitcoin Unlimited proposed solution. Okay, now on August 24th, the standard SegWit soft fork occurred. Thus, old nodes that did not follow the new rules were invalidated, and the chain continues on with the backwards compatible update. The new post-SegWit chain is now going to be called Chain B. It is fundamentally different from the original Chain A. Bitcoin acts differently after this implementation. If you remember, SegWit changes the way in which transactions are implemented and stored in the block. There is a far larger change occurring here than with the BCH fork. Finally, off of Chain B, there is another hard fork that occurs, this being SegWit 2x. Chain B still exists, and BTC, with its SegWit 2x implementation, forks from that chain into a third chain, which is the real Bitcoin. Now, we're dealing with a pretty interesting philosophical question. The ship of Theseus. The way this goes is the great hero Theseus has a ship that he sailed on to battle. During his adventures, boards would rot from the seawater and were replaced. Each time one of the boards were removed, they were brought back to his home city and assembled in a museum. Eventually, all of the boards in Theseus' ship were replaced, and in the museum stood a perfect replica of Theseus' original ship. Which is the real ship? Is it the ship made entirely from new boards, or is it the ship in the library made entirely of the original boards, then reassembled? Is there a metaphysical, or some would say spiritual, property present within the object? Does the essence of the ship carry on to its new form? Is this new ship, which is completely different in every respect, the same ship? The natural inclination we have is to say yes. We have quite a lot of experience in this regard. The cells in our body are replaced every 7 years or so. We are effectively a completely different entity, but there's a lasting continuity. Many cultures refer to this as a soul. Secular cultures would refer to this as an ego. On the other hand, a ship has no essence. Its existence is physical. It is a tool comprised of specific parts in a specific arrangement. The real ship is the recreated ship in the museum. All of the pieces are identical to the original ship. All of the pieces are in their appropriate place. It's clear that the essence of a thing is simply an illusion, and the actual entity is the parts it is comprised of. We have difficulty not viewing the recreated ship as being the original due to our predisposition towards object permanence. I am sure you have your opinion, but there's really no correct answer in the matter. Back to Bitcoin Cash versus Bitcoin. Who has the real coin? Technically speaking, Roger Ver's claim that Bitcoin Cash is the real Bitcoin is really not that far off. BCH, much like the ship in the museum, is the closest to the original Bitcoin protocol. Functionally speaking, it operates in the same way as Bitcoin that exists prior to SegWit, like the Bitcoin that experienced the parabolic run-up. Are his marketing strategies a bit unethical? Probably. But in a hyper-capitalistic, unregulated, dog-eat-dog market, that's what you should expect. Bitcoin, or Bitcoin Core if you're a Bitcoin Cash fan, is the current iteration of the chain. It is also Bitcoin. It is the ship that Theseus continued to sail on, the ship that had to replace its rotting boards. For all intents and purposes, it is actually the true Bitcoin because it has continued on with the metaphysical essence of the original Bitcoin. If you're of the opinion that Bitcoin is the true and only Bitcoin, you're incorrect philosophically speaking, but functionally you are correct as well. I told you these things could be tricky. You, as the reader, are free to make up your mind on the matter. I don't care either way. For the sake of transparency, however, I will elaborate on my opinion briefly. My take on Bitcoin Cash versus Bitcoin. Due to the direction the current version of the Bitcoin protocol is taking, SegWit 2x and its adoption of the Lightning Network, discussed in the next chapter, I think has begun to shy away from its original idea of being a decentralized peer-to-peer electronic cash system. I believe Lightning Network, while being a very clever programming feat, serves to centralize the Bitcoin network and makes it a lot more like Visa than a decentralized cryptocurrency. For that reason, despite it being the metaphysical continuation of Bitcoin, it is way different than the original essence. Is this a bad thing? Not really. I actually am curious to see how the experiment plays out. There's a level of intelligence found in the crowd, especially in the case of open source projects. This could turn out to be a great direction for the coin, especially since the Lightning Network does open up room for smart contracts. However, it is pretty impossible to argue that Bitcoin Cash is not Bitcoin. It has a shared history and is the closest to the original protocol. Just saying.